Good morning, colleagues. Thanks for joining us this morning, and welcome to our colleagues in Pretoria. Also told there are people who are joining us on YouTube as well as Facebook. The AG will be taking you through the audit outcomes of national as well as provincial government. Joining him this morning is our Deputy AG, Tsakani Maluleke. They'll be taking your question afterwards, and for those who have arranged post-briefing interviews, they'll be available to talk to you. Without wasting any time, over to you, AG.
Sorry. Oh, thank you very much for getting. Audit outcomes for both national departments and entities, together with the outcomes of all the 9 provinces. This is what we often refer to as the PFMA audit outcomes, covering the institutions that we individually reported on at the end of July, whose annual reports have already been tabled in the different legislatures. So today we are coming forth to share the common themes, the trends, the outcome of the analysis, as well as the global picture of financial management and such related activities as they pertain to national departments and provinces. But before I get to the core detail of what is contained in the media release, which I hope everybody present has a copy of, I thought I'll preface the actual media release with a few comments on some matters that often arise when we deliver these audit outcomes. I've captured this as an attempt to clear some of the conceptual matters. First of all, I'd like to say that these audit outcomes give an indication of the general governance environment within which a department or public entity functions. You will see in these outcomes, we also speak of a clean audit, which gives an indication of a well-governed environment where we find good risk management and strong internal controls. As we look at it from an audit perspective, this is an environment where management have accurate information to make decisions, which in turn create a solid foundation to be able to deliver on the promises made in government strategies, as often contained in the estimates of national expenditure. So when a department or a public entity does not have a clean audit, it highlights certain warning signals that the environment in which the auditee functions is less than desirable. Not having a grip on financial affairs, not having access to accurate performance information, or have a culture where the rule of law is not respected, creates a fertile environment for inappropriate management of public resources. This can range from not having accurate information available for decision making to the other extreme, where there's widespread abuse of public finances. So I thought I'll clear firstly the whole concept of a clean audit so that it's clear from which angle do we see this as an auditor. The other concept, I guess, which is important for purposes of these outcomes is the concept of an irregular expenditure. So when we deal with irregular expenditure, it can also be seen from a similar light. But at a very basic level, irregular expenditure is expenditure incurred in contravention of legal requirements and prescribed policies that govern supply chain management. While it is easy to talk this away as administrative weaknesses, or to claim that there was no money stolen or misappropriated, it still creates a similar fertile environment for mismanagement of public resources. So if one looks at the Public Finance Management Act, it prescribes that when these warning signals are surfaced through an audit, they need to be investigated and dealt with. It's not about what they represent or what they do not represent. It's about the instruction in the Public Finance Management Law to say those that are charged with governance must take these matters on, investigate them, and act on them. That's the only time after that step has been taken that all of us will know whether there has been any financial loss or whether it happened as a result of some incompetence of one kind or another. So those are very important clarifications I thought we need to make up front as we try to drill into the detail of these audit outcomes. So if one looks at both a clean audit and irregular expenditure, in both instances there's a need for management, especially accounting officers, to react to these indicators in the environment. So that's the call that we're making as I'm going to go through these outcomes, to say that it is now the task of accounting officers, as well as the leadership in the oversight structures in the system, to begin to act now on these issues of accountability. It is always a sad day if an accounting officer is not even prepared to react on known weaknesses or risks in the environment in which they function. So as I go through these outcomes today, I'm going to be emphasizing the need for accounting officers, as well as those that are charged with oversight, to take ownership of preventative controls. Because if one looks at the different elements of what is in the PFMA, the regulations that govern financial management, they all are biased towards preventative strategies, rather than trying to rely on whether we are going to detect it, if you're lucky, and be able to correct and recover it after the money has changed hands. So that's important to note that in these outcomes, much as we will be reflecting on what we have assessed over the last year, the concept of elevating preventative controls across the entire system is going to become very prominent as we go through the analysis of these outcomes. Preventative controls, which are a proactive effort by management at the starting point of an entity under an accounting officer to prevent the mismanagement of resources. I know that you are going to recall from memory that prevention is always better than cure. It's not an auditing concept. That's why I think that you will recall from your own memory. But also, in addition to this, we are going to elevate the role of internal audit and audit committees. In most instances, when these annual reports are submitted to Parliament, including the financial statements that we audit, they often have a report of an audit committee. But when you go through one year after another, there's normally similar type of issues that are reported on by the audit, with a glaring lack of consequences for those that continue to deviate from the accounting disciplines. So enough of that, and I'm going to start getting straight to now the media release, having explained some of those key issues, which I thought need to be kept in mind as we go through the detail of the numbers. So as I say, we have interacted across all provinces in the last few months, together with oversight committees in the National Assembly. And we've interacted also with the Forum of South African Directors General, which is a forum of all DGs in provinces as well as the ones in the national sphere. And our last engagement was with the Cabinet, where we also interacted with the executive nationally to share with them a lot of what we are going to be tabling today. That's why we had moved this media release last week to this week. We just needed an opportunity to engage the last round of engagements with Cabinet, which we did yesterday. So we are here now, having assured ourselves that we're going to speak about the audit outcomes of people that we have already spoken to. So there's no mystery here. Everybody knows what we talk about in respect to these outcomes. As we start looking at the 2018-2019 audit outcomes, we've concluded that these are disappointing audit results for 2018-2019, as they show a slow progress over the past 5 financial years, meaning that the improvements that were promised and committed over a number of years have not come forth. And on the screens, you will also see the outcomes as we analyze them overall in respect of the different colors that we've used to describe each one of those different audit outcomes. Part of the reason for this slow progress is largely to do with the fact that those that are charged with governance were very slow in implementing the commitments that they had made in previous years. In some instances, the recommendations that were made in the audit were totally disregarded, which means that the control environment of yesteryears is almost similar in the current year. Hence, the audit outcomes do not change in any significant way. So that is the overall picture and the overall conclusion that we reach when we look at all of them. One of the most important developments, if you look at the second page of our media release, was the promulgation of the 1st of April 2019 this year as the effective date for the application of the amendments that were approved and adopted by Parliament at the end of the 5th Parliament. We were fortunate that we had already submitted our regulations to Parliament, and therefore we were ready for this financial year, which ended on 31 March 2019, to implement, at least on a phase-in basis, some of these provisions of the amendments. In this context, we were able to develop a basis for selecting which ones we're going to start with, considering that we only had 3 months to navigate the environment before we were reaching the date of the audit report. So we selected 16 different auditees, which we reflect on in this report. Somewhere when you try to figure out what's going on, you can quickly turn to page 22 of this report just to figure out our analysis with regards to those 16 auditees as to how they have fared, but I'll speak to them as well in turn later on. But in this report from page 22 onwards, you will find some detail with regards to which those 16 were and what the outcomes of those were in regards to these new provisions. I think it's also important to note that this amendment on 1 April did not necessarily change what an audit is about. It added another consideration to the audit, which is the introduction of a material irregularity, which means that the auditors, while they are carrying on their audit work, are now also required to do a lot more work to identify instances where there is non-compliance or a contravention of legislation, which could be as a result of possible fraud or theft that is likely to lead to a financial loss to the public purse. A very clear definition which says that normally an audit is associated with a sampling process where you pick up certain transactions, but in this instance, auditors are required to go deeper into certain transactions, which is what we are reporting on page 22, having selected 16 of these. Quick reflection on the initial impressions that we got as we were rolling out these amendments. We found accounting officers that were ready to react to a number of these material irregularities that were identified. And you'll see in the report how many of them have responded. But also, among these that we selected, we also did not find specific material irregularities. I think in about 4 of them, they are set out in the report which ones those are. So we went in with the suspicion or expectation that we might find, but once we scrutinized the records, we were happy to have cleared some of those that we had initially thought would be material irregularities. So the journey continues with regards to this implementation of the new amendment. I think it's important that we all know we could not have rolled it out everywhere, otherwise it would have collapsed our team's ability to do this new thing with people that have not necessarily been properly trained in terms of how they are going to react to it. Let me also emphasize the point that in terms of these new provisions and the amendments to the Public Audit Act, they are an attempt to help us re-emphasize ownership of basic accountability by accounting officers and accounting authorities. It is in the event that they ignore that counsel that it will land at a point where they may have to get a certificate of debt for not being responsive to audit recommendations that might result in a financial loss to the entity. So I think it is important to take note of that part, but I'll speak in detail further on with regards to that particular matter. If we look at audit outcomes at a glance, which is depicted in that map of South Africa, here we give an assessment of each of the audit outcomes by province, considering the current year versus the previous year in terms of each one of the provinces. And then on the far top left of this map, you'll see the audit outcomes of the number of entities and departments that were audited nationally. It's quite clear, looking at the map, which provinces have done consistently well, which provinces continue to disappoint, which provinces have made some baby steps in the positive direction. There are many that have got that characteristic here, where the number of clean audits are starting to grow again, but not enough work is done to deal with issues of non-compliance with supply chain matters, among others. If you look at KZN, you'll see some of those elements. If you look at Mpumalanga, it's got a number of those elements where non-compliance with supply chain and other financial management regulations is not often observed. The Free State, which is the only province among all of them that does not even have a clean audit, as I described it earlier on. But the others, as I said, are taking baby steps, showing some improvements, but in certain areas, the overall disregard for financial management laws and regulations is pervasive. I think that is characterized largely by the dominance of the purple color, which is the qualified audits, as well as the red and the yellow. The yellow ones, if one looks at all of them, can claim that they have accounted accurately in the accounting records for the transactions that they entered into. However, while they were doing that, there was not always respect for the likes of your supply chain management rules. So you can account for it accurately for as long as you do not close the leakage. Nobody knows that which you've accurately accounted for if it was to be put to a competitive process, whether you couldn't have bought it for cheaper than you did. So those are some of the reflections that you will find when you look at one of the sections of this report that goes through the detail of each of the provinces, giving you a blow-by-blow account of some of the programs that we've looked at. And that analysis in this report starts from page 142, just if you want to flag it and you want to find where to see the detail of each of the provinces, as well as what are the main factors by province that contributed to this. I'll deal with it in the media release in detail as well, but the finer detail of it will be found in page 142 onwards, where we deal with the overall provincial analysis. I'm now on page 4. Now let's talk a bit about the reporting on year 1 of the enhanced AG powers. As I said, if I may just repeat this concept of a material irregularity, which was introduced in section 5 of the Public Audit Act. It says that when we do an audit and we find a transaction that has not complied or has contravened some legislation, whether it is supply chain legislation or any other, or the auditors have got a suspicion that it might be because of fraudulent activity, theft, or a breach of a fiduciary duty, and has already resulted or is likely to result in a material financial loss, and so on and so on. We must report that particular transaction, which is called a material irregularity, in the audit report. Now, in the past, it wouldn't go to the audit report. It would be reported in a management letter, which is a document that is distributed by the auditors to the accounting officer, with a view to getting the accounting officer to fix the specific identified internal controls in the system. In this case, if there is a material irregularity at the end of the audit, the auditors are required to report it in the audit report with a specific recommendation as to the steps that must be taken to address the issue of a financial loss if it has already arisen, or to prevent it from arising if it were to arise in the future. Once it is reported in the audit report, the significance of this is that the audit report goes together with the financial statements in the annual report. And once the annual report is tabled in a legislature, it is a public document. So everybody who then reads that annual report will also find an audit report in there, which means anyone who wants to know the extent of material irregularities that have been identified, it's all out in the annual report every year of any entity. Hence, the issue of the transparency of this matter, so that at any one stage we can know what is the extent of transactions that were carried out where there was a possible financial loss to the system, which was carried out in contravention of specific financial management laws and regulations. On top of that, the Auditor-General, in terms of the amended powers, also has the power to now refer a specific matter if the auditor is not able to conclude on that matter within the period of the audit, which is normally 60 days, that an audit is carried out from the financial year end to the end of July. The AG can refer this matter to a public body to investigate in order to get to the bottom of it. If, for example, there's a big housing project and the auditors pick up a few invoices that indicate that there's a possibility of a material irregularity, within that period of doing the audit of financial statements, it is unlikely that the auditors will have sufficient time to get to the bottom of scrutinizing contracts, interviewing and engaging the suppliers and contract managers and all of that. So this referral power is to allow for a situation where a body that has got the requisite competencies and skills and tools to be able to get to the bottom of what was behind all of this, so that it doesn't become something that gets investigated after 5 or 10 years. So that is the first point in terms of the new powers that we have. But any recommendation that arises from that investigation will also flow back to the Auditor-General, so that the Auditor-General can then make sure it is communicated through the audit report as a recommendation of the audit. So once a recommendation is issued, as we have done now in terms of the ones that we selected, which are on page 22, that recommendation has got an expiry date. So if you recommend at the 31st of July that you must fix whatever it is that we've identified as a material irregularity within 3 months, it means that by the end of October, you must have taken steps to implement that recommendation. If you implement that recommendation in accordance with the way the Auditor-General suggested, and we find evidence that you've done it, that material irregularity falls away. It's no longer an issue. If you decided that you are not going to do it by the end of October, which is the end of the 3 months that was given, and we arrive on the 1st of November and we see that nothing has happened, it now becomes a case of the Auditor-General having to issue a binding remedial action once you ignore the recommendation after the prescribed period. It now becomes a binding remedial action, which binding remedial action has also got an expiry date. So if the binding remedial action is also given another 90 days for the accounting officer or accounting authority to fix it, and they fix it within that 90 days by the 31st of January, then if they've done it according to what that binding remedial action prescribed, for example, it could be that you shall recover that overpayment of 20 million which could not be explained during the audit. If you do take steps to recover it, and you made a double payment, for argument's sake, on a contract, and you recover it, put it in the bank, by the 31st of January, the material irregularity falls away. Meaning that we are happy what you've done has restored the financial loss to the position where the public purse should have been. Come that day, 31st January, you are still in a quandary as to what to do. You haven't figured it out, nor have you implemented anything to prove that you have taken steps according to the PFMA requirements of an accounting officer to stop the financial loss. If you didn't, then from the 1st of February, last power of the office is to say, if you've ignored the recommendation for the period given, as well as the binding remedial action, we are now in the territory of issuing a certificate of debt in the name of an accounting officer or accounting authority who has got direct responsibility with the matter that was identified. It is at that point, which is the last part of the 3 key powers given to the office through the amendment, that we will start factoring in considerations of natural justice. You shall be heard, you've got a right to make representations, and there shall be an independent body that will adjudicate the matter so that the AG does not become the prosecutor of the matter as well as the judge on the same matter. So every accounting officer, as you can see, will have sufficient time to navigate the environment in order to address the issues that are identified through the material irregularity provisions. So that's what we're doing now, in addition to what we had always been doing in the past. You'll recall in the past we would issue a report with a management letter and recommendations and persuade almost to no end an accounting officer to please make sure that you implement these recommendations. As I said earlier on, some of the cases, this has gone on and on and on for 5 years, right up to 10 years and all of that. But these provisions are an attempt to say there are already provisions in the PFMA that require you to do this. It is the instrument of the audit that will accelerate the process towards taking the required actions in order to prevent massive financial losses in the system. So that is the real essence of what we are about in terms of these material irregularities. And if one looks at page 7 of the media release, we then give you an analysis as is contained in that section I referred to in the report on page 22, where we show the 16 entities that we identified for purposes of testing for these material irregularities. On the bottom of page 7, we are already able to share through this annual report the nature of these material irregularities that we identified and quantified them with regards to what they were about and which entities they related to. At the bottom, there's a category of them which arise as a result of unfair or uncompetitive procurement processes, leading among others to overpricing of goods and services procured. And we've quantified this among the ones where we've identified these material irregularities, which means the 8 out of the 16, which are annotated in pink here. The total of those was, in essence, about 11 different material irregularities, amounting to 438 million through the scrutiny of these financial statements. In the past, we never had to worry about this, but now this gives us a specific sense in respect to where does this conduct arise from, in which areas is it, and what recommendations and steps need to be taken to address it. The next one is with regards to unfair procurement processes resulting in supplier appointed that did not deliver. This is largely to do with those locomotives at PRASA. That's why there's one entity. This is PRASA, this 2.2 billion of material irregularity associated with unfair procurement processes resulting in a supplier appointed that did not deliver that which was ordered. So the section that deals with these material irregularities has got specific detail, which is largely what has found its way into the audit report. You will note that we have not yet arrived at a point where there is consideration of issuing a certificate of debt because we are not there yet. We have not yet arrived at a point where the recommendation that was made has expired. And also we have already taken steps to begin to refer those that require referral in the context of the material irregularities identified. So we are getting there in respect to the timelines so that we don't try and do this quickly and find ourselves we have not adhered to the procedures and the regulations, and then we then get taken on and then we can't stand up and explain exactly what has happened. Let's look at the total quantity in respect of amount. The heading on the media release that's headed overall outcome is saying to us, of the 16 that we selected, 4 of them we were not able to complete these audits, and those are the ones that are blue on the page. Starting from the water trading entity, it was delayed due to a number of issues on the audit. The Community Safety and Transport Management in the Northwest, Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, and SAA Technical. As you know, the financial statements have been missing for the last 2 years. So these 4, we have not really quantified or determined any material irregularities that would have arisen because these audits were outstanding as at the 15th of October. The ones in green were subjected to the same provisions of looking for these material irregularities, and all 4 of these did not have any material irregularities identified. That is Correctional Services, Department of Defense, Education, and Health. And then the ones that are pink are the ones where we have identified the material irregularities during that 3-month window period of the first phase in. Now, in total, as you can see along the page, we've got 28, and they are split into each one of those different departments, starting from human settlements right up to education, Limpopo. All of those 8 in total among them have got 28 material irregularities, which add up to 2.81 billion of possible or actual financial loss in respect of this particular definition. You'll also see that this 2.81 billion is made up of those 5 boxes at the bottom. If you look at the category of issues, if you add them up, they add up to 2.81 billion, which means that in all of the 432 financial statements, having selected a sample of 16 this year, we've identified material irregularity among 8 entities, adding up to 2.8 billion. We have not made an attempt to extrapolate what this could have been had we selected everybody. It will be difficult, but I guess some people make assumptions about these things and extrapolate them, but we didn't try to do that because it was really just a small sample we started with. But what it does say is that there's no shortage of material irregularities in the system in which financial management is handled in our public space, both in provinces as well as in national departments. This indicator tells us that there is no shortage of things that are happening in the financial systems which are material irregularities as defined. If you can find them among 8, having audited about 432 institutions, you can imagine if you had to have a test in each one of them, what you probably would come up with. But you'll be interested to know, so from here on, what next? Well, we have got the feedback from all our teams in the period leading up to the end of the audit cycle, and we have already decided that that 16 that we started with, because we've now trained more people, we've experienced the environment in terms of how responsive the accounting officers have been, as well as how technically difficult this whole area is, because we're looking for transactions that normally find their way into the dark, deep corners where you can't easily find them. So you've got to strengthen your capacity to forensically test transactions on an ongoing basis. So this is one of the key things that we are gearing up to the point where this year, for the 2020 year end, which comes in March, we've now ramped up the number of entities that we are going to select to subject them to this audit. And we've quantified them to about 89 almost, 89 different entities that we're going to audit in year 2, come the end of March 2020. Those 89, if you look at them in respect to the public budget, they represent about 70% of the public budget. So it's 89 representing a significant portion of the budget. There you will find the likes of education across all provinces and nationally, all the health departments across all provinces and nationally, all the roads and transport departments, all the infrastructure, public works, water and sanitation, human settlements, together with state-owned entities, will be included in that list for next year. Hence, it looks like a small number, but on an 80-20 rule, you can see that we are hitting 70% of the total budget just by ramping up that, because we don't want to get ourselves applying these new provisions of the material irregularities everywhere, because some of the issues are very tricky, they're complex, and we still need to also accept the fact that once you've got provisions like these, it's better to implement them responsibly so that you don't get your teams falling over trying to understand how to deal with certain aspects of these provisions, because they are still new even for those auditors. So we can safely say that there's enough here to track over the period of time, but it is important to bring back the point that I made earlier on, that a preventative controls regime is the best possible way that anyone who is an accounting officer could avoid having to go through the entire process right up to a possibility of a certificate of debt. Because if you do put in place controls that prevent the existence of material irregularities, as an accounting officer, these provisions will not be applied to you. So that is one point that needs to be made clear, to say that this is not just a wild chase, it is a process that is geared towards saying, let's rather prevent these through proper internal controls rather than try to deal with the fallout, which is about trying to recover that which may never be recovered. But when the effort is taken to try and recover, it often comes with additional cost. Because for one to get into the detail of the transaction, one needs to bring in forensic investigations. Then there's lawyers this side and lawyers that side, and there are all sorts of other things that end up making this report irrelevant after a long period of time because nobody acts on it. Hence, we emphasize the point that the public purse will benefit if preventative controls are made the order of the day. And that's the message that we've communicated across the board with all of the departments and entities. On page 8, we speak about the financial health of these auditees, where we also do a profile of provinces largely who have got a risk of financial health. Now, financial health arises where over a number of years you have had weak internal controls. You were not able to protect the public funds under your care, and you've allowed many situations where financial losses have been incurred. So over a number of years, then you realize that you no longer have sufficient money to do the things that you need to do. And that's what we're trying to do here under the financial health of auditees, where we look at a number of auditees to say how many of them across the board have now started having deficits where their expenditures exceed the revenue they've generated. The ones that struggle to pay creditors within the prescribed 30 days, as well as other financial health issues that are contained in the report. You'll see that quite a number of provinces have got this risk as depicted by the yellow as well as the pink color on the media release. The Northern Cape has got some significant financial health risk when it comes to the capacity to pay for amounts due in the future, as well as the likes of the Northwest, Mpumalanga, Limpopo, and the big one in terms of that risk is the Free State. So the Free State, having looked at it, is one where you've got a major financial health risk, which means that for as long as you have not been putting the right controls to manage the finances, you're now going to battle to have sufficient money to pay for certain things that you ought to pay for. The irregular expenditure on page 9, which is D, is currently sitting at 62.6 billion. You'll see in the cover page of the highlights of this report, it's stated in two numbers. The other number is 19, another one is 42. So if you add them together, that's what this 62 is about. It says 42.8 as well as 19.76. This was in respect of outstanding audits that had to be included in the initial figure. That's why the 62 is the official number. I've explained the conceptual issues around what this irregular expenditure is, and the point that we're emphasizing is that for as long as investigations on those transactions have not happened, we will never know what was behind it. And that's why we insist that investigation of these issues of irregular expenditure needs to be pointed out as a primary step that needs to be taken. Unauthorized expenditure is starting to decrease, at least that is good. We've noted a number of departments where they've now started sticking to what was budgeted, but it is a good sign to show that if you can decrease this unauthorized expenditure, you are also eliminating some of the pressures in the system. So we've got at least a positive flag with regards to the level of unauthorized expenditure. Fruitless and wasteful expenditure, another area that has increased. And this is clearly low-hanging fruit in the sense that fruitless and wasteful expenditure is avoidable in most instances. But you will note here that a lot of this has to do with claims and other amounts that are being recovered from the auditees where they have not efficiently done things that were expected of them. For example, in the health sector, there's a number of claims that had been paid, and the necessary steps to prevent those claims from arising were not always in place to satisfy the fact that the entity was doing its best to avoid it. We also say here in the media release, the overall increase was mostly also as a result of the loss of about 110 million by the National Department of Energy and 101 million by the Free State Department of Health. And these losses, they relate to additional storage costs, for example, for solar water geyser systems that were manufactured and stored by the supplier beyond the agreed storage period, as well as remedial work done on infrastructure projects. Those are the type of things that give rise to irregular expenditure. Then on state-owned entities, we also draw attention to the similar sentiment that a lot of the preventative controls, as well as the ability to introduce good controls in state-owned entities, have also landed many of them in trouble. And the point we are making in the report is that none of the ones that we audit have achieved a clean audit. The South African Post Office, for example, has slipped back to a qualified opinion, and the Department of, and rather the Development Bank of Southern Africa regressed from a clean audit to a financially unqualified with findings in the year under review. So these are findings that we made in the current year that were not there before, and many of them have given assurances that they are already taking steps to address those weaknesses that were identified in their financial statements. But the big issue, I think, for us with regards to the state-owned entities is also the instances of irregular expenditure. There's quite a number of them that failed to achieve a clean audit on the back of irregular expenditure. In essence, for them, this is about 1.4 billion of this total irregular expenditure is associated with some of these SOEs. The likes of Denel, South African Broadcasting Corporation, SA Express, SA Forestry Company. These ones were largely qualified on the basis that they were not able to prove that they have disclosed everything associated with their irregular expenditure. Hence, we say they were qualified on the completeness of the irregular expenditure they disclosed in their financial statements, because the law requires accounting officers to disclose instances or known instances of irregular expenditure in addition to that which is found by the auditors. So that is the extent of that. And then coming to the next page 12 on the provincial analysis. As I said, the detail of these provinces analysis is contained in page 142 onwards of the report. But here we just highlight a few areas that we thought will help in your analysis of what is contained in that report. First of all, when we look at the Western Cape, it continues to produce the best results comparatively speaking. Even if you look at that map on the board, you can see the prevalence of green, not only in the current year, but also in the previous year. A lot of this, as we have experienced the outcomes of this province, is also showing a good financial health status. Those controls that have largely been there, I'm sure if you expand that map to the last 5 years or 7 years, you'll pretty much see a similar picture, which means that a well-controlled environment hardly ever has financial health risks in it, because the manner in which budgets are managed and spent is consistent with what they have been planning over a period of time, and therefore there's no reason why there should be expenditures exceeding revenue, among other things. So the conclusion as far as this province is concerned, we're saying here that there has been a solid and consistent pattern of good audit outcomes in the province. And we attribute this largely to programs that were developed in this province over a number of years that put the provincial leadership and accounting officers at the center of driving that accountability and good governance culture. It's not left to accountants, it is driven by the people in the provincial leadership and other structures. And we were there in many of their sessions where they evaluate progress achieved on dealing with audit matters with their accounting officers. So we can attest to the fact that what we see here is what we have also, through our teams on quarterly engagements, experienced. So that's why this issue of the leadership taking center stage in addressing these matters and not dismiss them as administrative weaknesses in isolation from the fact that the only people who can demonstrate the seriousness about this are those that are at the leadership level. The Kwazulu-Natal Province, one of the key characteristics of this one is that the results overall in the KZN province remained unchanged. And this is one province that is taking the lead with regards to the total amount of irregular expenditure. So irregular expenditure in KZN across all those departments in that province is about 12.4 billion of that 62.6, which means then KZN has got the biggest portion of irregular expenditure in the current year, as well as the closing balance of irregular expenditure in KZN is 41.9 billion, is also the highest of all the provinces. That means that there's something there in that province that is a concentration of risk with regards to adherence to supply chain management prescripts. The Eastern Cape, has shown some flashes of positive progress in respect to a few of their departments, but we think that having looked at the entire province, greater effort is still required to sustain those outcomes, as well as to push the ones that are not in the clean space to come forward. So we have noted the initial steps taken to bring some improvements as far as the clean audits are concerned, but we've cautioned them that they have not yet done what is required of them. There's a lot that needs to be done with regards to others to be able to get them to turn the corner. The same context with regards to Limpopo. You'll note here that there's one or two improvements in some places, but they have not demonstrated the diligence required to constantly apply these preventative controls in their province. Some levels of irregular expenditure here as well as a widespread non-compliance with supply chain management is typical of the number of departments in this province. We've also seen that in certain cases they just disregard the recommendations that are made in the audit and not act on them. In Mpumalanga, there were a couple of improvements in previous years, and we started noting a regression coming out of this province. Over the last 5 years, they were largely erratic, their audit outcomes. You'll see the improvements here, and then big reversals, and then they come back. But here, this is the one time where we're starting to see the regressions now being prominent, and largely to do with a failure to institutionalize these internal controls. And in an environment where you've got instability of leadership in these positions, you also end up with a situation where the one comes and put in good controls, and then they get reversed when another group of people come to lead in that environment. So the internal control largely in the Mpumalanga province, as we analyze it through these reports, is largely unstable. So you are unlikely to get these good audit outcomes with that kind of an unstable environment. Gauteng is also, if you note from previous years, they've always had unqualified audits for a number of their departments. But that has reversed in the 2018-2019, where now you also have 2 departments that were disclaimed in Gauteng, which means that the Gauteng environment is starting to raise some risks from where they were before to now also picking up some disclaimed audit opinions. We have had an engagement also with the Premier in that province, and they've already taken steps to have a province-wide interaction on this matter in the next month. So we are hoping that they will do that which they have always done to try and restore some of the disciplines in this province. Northern Cape, another further regression, which is also largely informed by weakening internal controls with no consequences. And that's what the Northern Cape audit outcomes show. But we also noted that there was very little done to address the weaknesses that were picked up in financial management in the previous year. The Free State, there was an overall improvement if you look at it at a glance, year on year, but there are still big concerns with regards to the accountability for financial management in that province. We've made the point very clear that they've tried to put an effort to reduce disclaimed opinions, but that is not enough if you haven't turned these departments into clean audits. This is the only province that does not have clean audits, even though they've pushed from the bottom to try and eliminate disclaimed opinions. They still have a major task. Hence, the financial health risk in that province is also as pronounced as the lack of good financial management disciplines as shown in the financial audit outcomes. the Northwest as the last province, we have also had similar engagements here where we've also picked up some high levels of irregular expenditure, sitting at about 3.2 billion. You will note this province was put under administration, but for the year that we are auditing, those interventions came in the tail end of the financial year. The financial year is the end of March 2019, and those interventions would have come in on or about that time, so they probably would not have made much difference. But what is notable with the Northwest is that there has not been a regression, which means that we are not picking up a significant reversal. We hope that with the interventions of the Premier and those interventions by the executive over time will probably stop the decline and start seeing something happening going into the future. So the interministerial task team, which is the structure that is working with the Premier, at least for the purposes of these outcomes, we'll see in the next outcomes if any big difference is coming through either on the provincial departments or in the reports that will be finalized for municipalities come the end of next week, because the audit reports for municipalities are due for sign off next week. So that is the overall picture with regards to the provinces, as well as one more point, I think, with regards to the national departments. Many of the outstanding audits, particularly if you look at the map of the national departments, it was largely your state-owned entities that didn't submit their financial statements for a number of reasons. Others were challenged by issues of going concern. Others were not ready. Others felt that they needed to address certain issues over an extended period of time before they were able to submit their financial statements. I think you are all aware about the conversation that's already happened in Parliament last week with respect to the national carrier, but there are many others that have subsequently submitted their financial statements, especially where there were a number of disagreements with the auditors. Those matters were dealt with and sorted out subsequent to the cutoff date. The last point on page 15, which I thought I will deal with, is the issue of the preventative measures that we think have now become a very important and significant consideration if we are to look at audit outcomes in the future and say this is typical of what we expect, because all the steps that are required to be put in place in terms of preventing financial losses have been put in place. As we communicated with leadership in the country across all these provinces and in the national sphere, as well as oversight in Parliament, including portfolio committees through the chair of chairs and many others, we have been putting an emphasis on this matter and saying that even if you've given the audit office additional powers, if you do not have preventative controls, it is no good just having those powers when nobody prevents financial losses from happening. And you are not trying to introduce something that's not there. If one looks very carefully at the PFMA in terms of its provisions, as well as what it says the role and responsibility of an accounting officer and an accounting authority, specifically in section 38, you'll see that all of those things are about preventing financial losses from happening. And we do put an emphasis on this to say that many organizations control things, but sometimes they control them just because they are told to control something. For as long as you're not understanding what you are trying to control or you are trying to prevent, that control will not be good enough, because all you'll do, you'll just show the evidence of a signature on a piece of paper, saying that I was required according to the approval framework to sign this document. Here's this document, I've signed it. That is not what the law requires. The law requires somebody to scrutinize this document they are signing, so that if there's an additional 10% that is being paid to a service provider over and above the amount contracted, that person can ask the necessary questions to prevent something that is unauthorized from being paid. That's what we think the system needs to put in place now, because if you've got that in place in large numbers everywhere, you'll get to a point where there are limited material irregularities. But it doesn't end there. It also comes to Parliament when departments and entities submit their quarterly financial information as required through legislation. The people who sit on the portfolio committee need to begin to empower themselves with questions that will prevent certain things from slipping their attention, because they are the ones who approve the annual performance plans. They are the ones who know what budgets are being spent, and they are better placed as oversight to deal with those matters from a preventative point of view. So we were very encouraged in the interaction we had with the chair of chairs, where all the portfolio committee chairs sit, where they made an undertaking, and we have referred to it in this media release on the second last paragraph of the media release. Where we say we are also encouraged by the decision taken by the Committee of Chairs in the National Assembly upon presentation of these overall national audit outcomes. They have already decided to review and workshop the parliamentary oversight model to ensure that they deliberately incorporate some of the matters we have elevated through this report. This is to help strengthen the focus of portfolio committees. This interaction is planned for January-February 2020 as part of a comprehensive national response to these audit outcomes. I think the essence of this is that they've taken note of the fact that the in-year reports as well as the in-year monitoring process happens through their committees, but a lot of these things still slip through. And that's why they've also asked us to come and assist them as they navigate how they are going to reorientate the parliamentary oversight model through the workshop that they are talking about. So that's where we say that the preventative approach to dealing with these financial management issues for us is possibly the best. And it applies also to the likes of your internal audit and audit committees. Because in most instances, when you look at the annual reports of most departments that we report on, there's always a report of internal audit, there's always a report of audit committees, but they don't drill down enough to help identify what is it that was a deficiency while they were exercising their oversight over these entities. It is part of that instrument of oversight as well that we say it now needs to take on more preventative measures to make sure that very little slips through to a point where it becomes consistently adverse or consistently qualified. So that is the overall essence of this. And again, if one looks at our amendment as an overall comment now, it's also positioned as a preventative approach to dealing with issues of an audit. Because if I'm an accounting officer and I've got nothing else to lose, and I know that when an audit starts, it might end up with a certificate of debt written in my name further down the line, then I will start thinking twice about how do I become effective in implementing those preventative controls that are there for an accounting officer. If I ignore it, then I know that I ignore it at my own peril. But if you know that the audit is going to end up with a very strong hand that will be supported at the right level of leadership, then many things could probably be accounted for properly, and they probably would pass the test of an independent audit. So thank you very much, and that is the end of our input for purposes of this year's audit outcomes.
Thanks, AG. Colleagues will now take your questions. We'll start here with a set of 4, and then we'll move to Pretoria. I see you, Linda, Marianne. 2 more questions. You introduce yourself and your media house.
Good morning, Mr. Kwazulu. Linda Ensor from Business Day. I'm just a bit confused about the total amount of fruitless and wasteful expenditure. The statement says 849 million for 223 auditees. Now, is that the total amount, or is there some other amount that for the rest of the auditees? If you could also just then confirm the unauthorized expenditure of 1.4 billion and the number of auditees, and also the worst and the best performing national departments, please. Thanks. Sorry.
Good afternoon, Marianne Merton from Daily Maverick. Your staff, how have they fared this year? In previous years, we had reports of intimidation. I think there were incidents of attacks, even cars, things like that. What is the situation on that, and how is that being managed? And just a tiny clarification in terms of the timelines with regards to the 16 auditees that are already under the new power framework, for want of a better explanation. You said that the period for recommendations hasn't yet expired. When would that period expire? Because I'm thinking 1st of April, July. So if you could just clarify that, thank you.
Okay, let me start with the worst and best performing national auditees. We historically have not done that analysis, Linda, but I think in looking at the report, I'm sure you'll pick it up that there's a number of elements that contribute to somebody becoming the best performing versus someone being the worst performing. But my view on this one is that it will take getting into the report to actually make that determination, because we avoid making the comparison. There are a lot of things that are different between departments and that also are context specific with regards to, trying to get who's the best and who's the worst. So I'm sorry I'm not able to give you names in respect of that. Then I'll come back to the one on the fruitless and wasteful expenditure and unauthorized expenditure. Let me deal with the ones Marianne raised regarding the staff intimidation. Once this thing reared its head, I think in 2017 or 18, we put in place a mechanism in the office to make people alert to instances where they feel threatened, even if it's not a real threat, because most threats do not necessarily come like that. We've got a reporting mechanism that is in place where staff do report those matters, and we do a follow-up, and we sometimes take steps to make sure that they are safe at an instance. But in terms of these audit outcomes, there was not much of that happened with regards to the PFMA cycle. In fact, what we experienced among these entities that we picked up for audit, there was a lot of cooperation from the accounting officers, especially in the PFMA cycle. The municipalities' audits are underway. Last week, you would have seen also the problems that we encountered with our staff at Nelson Mandela, where all of a sudden, when they arrived in the office where they do the audit work, there was an envelope that contained an article that was reported in the Weekend Post, which was an article about the rapid transport system audit that I think everybody who follows what happens with those transactions at Nelson Mandela knows that it's a matter that was reported on in previous years already. Now there was a matter pertaining to them not getting the tranche of their funding. And what was reported in that article was that part of the reason for it has to do with the issues that were reported in the audit. But it's history, it's stuff that pertains to previous years of audit work. So the staff was rattled because it was a case of, why put this article in this envelope and address it to us? You know, because in the article there was a reference to some of the small, medium enterprises now feeling that if no fiscal resources are going to come their way, they might suffer. So it was almost a case of, it's not easy just to ignore something like this. It might happen that somebody is really trying to say, these audit outcomes that you issue are probably responsible for the fact that we might not get the money that we do. So this is the kind of things that we are now starting to see, because people are scared that these material irregularity provisions are now digging a lot deeper into places where such inquiries were not made before. But we do have a process to manage these. Hence, when we got the feedback on this one, it was within the day of getting the feedback that we said the staff must not return to Nelson Mandela Bay municipality. You'll see in one of the articles, it says they were chased away. It was a case of don't return because you were not there. One person saw this, but the team was yet to go back. So we just said the team must please stay back and not go back to Port Elizabeth. So I'm sure you may have got an impression of people who were carrying their bags running away. No, that is not what is happening. It was just to be safe, let's not go there. We will have an interaction with the leadership of the institution to say, if we are to proceed with this audit, you must also create an environment for our people to operate properly during the audit. The meeting was scheduled to happen this week sometime. I think they're still trying to find dates to make sure that that plan is put in place. But it will definitely be putting pressure on the completion of the Nelson Mandela Bay municipality audit, among others, because the audits are being signed off next week, and the team will probably not be done by the end of next week if they have not yet met with the leadership of the institution. The 16 auditees with regards to the expiry of the recommendation. The recommendation for the first phase, Marianne, we have not been hard and fast about those, but we have communicated through the audit with the accounting officer that we've got a limited time within which to deal with these matters, because there was a very small sample, and it was in the process of trying to also firm up those dates in the regulations that we are now updating as well, just to make sure that we've got sufficient time, because not every transaction will take 6 months to go through and 3 months to go through and investigate. Others will be large contracts that have got complex provisions that need to be unpacked once a recommendation has surfaced. So it might take longer than, so we can't have a standard date, and that's why we were trying to figure this out and used 3 months. But we believe that for many transactions, for example, if you made a prepayment, as an example, to a service provider, and you have not got the service yet that you were buying, and we have no doubt that here's money leaving the bank, and here's a debit put in the books as a prepayment, let's say of 20 million. And we say to you, can you explain to us what you were paying for to entity ABC? Because we haven't seen any invoice purporting to be delivering something. So if you can explain this, then the recommendation is that you must recover that 20 million and put it back in the bank account, as an example. That should not take 9 months, as an example. So that's how we are going to play those periods. It will be determined by what are we dealing with. Are we dealing with a straightforward transaction, or are we dealing with a complex conundrum of provisions that need to be unpacked in order to get to the sustainable answer with regards to that. It could be a huge road construction project. It could be a huge infrastructure delivery project for water and all sorts of things. But on the other hand, it could be a third-party service provider who was trying out his business and got a contract, but now needs to be helped in order to start up. Let's say you give them a 10 million prepayment as an example. So those are the kind of things that we'll take into account. And I'm sure as we ramp up with the next year, we would have firmed up a lot of these dates, and we would have put in place this external body of people that we will also source externally from the office, who will become part of that adjudication mechanism come the point when we are ready to issue a certificate of debt. So there's still work that we're doing here, and that's why we say that if you look at most laws that were agreed to and signed in March, many of them have not even left the out tray after they were signed, but ours has already left the out tray. It's already in motion. So we are now also making sure that we are reasonable enough to take into account all sorts of natural justice provisions in dealing with these matters, so that people do not say I was not given sufficient time to address this matter when they test this thing through their rights in court. All right. Okay. Thanks. Then, Linda, on the other side, with regards to the fruitless and wasteful, you are spot on there with regards to the 849 million relating to 223 auditees, and you will find further detailed reference as to the many contributors on page 99 of the report.
Made of 758 million, which could be added to the figure if you take into account the outstanding. So it could be more than the 849. I just want to check that.
Yeah, no, that's exactly the point. Yeah, because for as long as you've got auditees that have not been signed off, and you know that historically they've always had that type of expenditure. So that expenditure that you've got there, which is based on actual financial signed, could increase.
Also, just another thing is the number of auditees that are included in your report here.
432 in total.
But now it mentions there's 770.
Where?
Page 19. Yeah, page 19. 770.
770. There's a glitch on page 19. It's supposed to be 432. We can sort it out, but the definite number is 432. 432, yeah. That's a gremlin there. There's no 770. I can stand out here now and say it's wrong. And then your unauthorized expenditure is 1.4 billion, as you have read it. And the detail is on page 98 of the key contributors to that. All right? Yeah.
Pretoria, do you have any questions?
Good afternoon. From Pretoria, we don't have any question. Back to you.
Thanks. We'll take the last round. Tubasa, you covered. Thanks. In the absence of any questions, the AG will wrap up and we'll do one-on-ones afterwards. Thanks again.
One more question. Would you say say that the Gauteng has regressed?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
All right, thank you very much. As I said, in terms of these amendments, again, when you look at municipalities, we are signing off on municipalities' financial statements next week, and we are reporting the general report on municipalities in the towards the second quarter of next year, after we've done the analysis similarly. But we do believe that there's two things that stand out in terms of this year's audit. There hasn't been any improvement in a number of places if you look at them overall. The area of disciplines of internal control is still the major challenge across the system. And we think that at the outset, when we interact with all of these entities at different places, we are going to be focusing the attention on these preventative controls. Because if you think about preventative controls, these are the controls that are already paid for, in the sense that the people that were envisaged to help protect the public purse are already in those positions. It's not a case of you must now get thousands of new people to come and do preventative controls. You might just want to check whether they have what it takes to put those preventative controls in place. But it's something that I think we need to think about carefully, even if we look at our state-owned entities. If you don't prevent the weaknesses that we identify in internal controls, they, after a number of years, become the billions of money that are needed to help them continue in their operations. So we'd like to thank you for this, and we know that, as you have done before, you've always placed a lot of emphasis on the matters that we think are prominent without belittling any others that you might want to write about. But the general report that we've presented today has got all of that detail, and we look forward to further interactions with yourselves. Thank you very much.